So, welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to today's event with Sir Richard Layard that is organized by the Department of Economics. So there are many important people here from the business world, from politics, from the academic world, and just ordinary citizens who are interested in this topic. What could be more important than to know what makes you happy? So many people think that the science of economics is only about budget deficits, about production growth, income distribution, the effects of taxes and other regulations. Of course, it is also about this. However, over the last 30 to 40 years, if you think that is the only thing that economists do, you're wrong. It's a caricature view of economics that was perhaps true 30 to 40 years ago. During the last few decades, economics underwent a revolution in the sense that economists have become interested, and I believe have interesting things to say, on a much broader array of topics. These topics range from child development, education, marriage, love, the social and other determinants of mental and physical health, to the determinants of happiness and life satisfaction. It is a great honor that we can welcome today an economist who has pursued and greatly contributed to this wider and broader vision of economics. It is an honor for me to welcome Richard Layard at the University of Zurich. Richard has made important contributions through his work, and he constantly reminds us that while undoubtedly important, higher income and wealth are associated with decreasing, sometimes sharply decreasing additions to our life satisfaction, or in economic language, to decreasing marginal utility of income. But why is this the case? And what are the other important drivers of happiness? How can we measure well-being? And what are the public policy implications of research on the determinants of happiness and life satisfaction? Well, this is exactly what today's lecture is about. So just that you know it, the people in the front, they will also be filmed, so if you don't want to be filmed, well, there's not much space left. You have to be filmed. Now let me introduce Richard Layard. He's Professor Emeritus and a member of the House of Lords. He's Professor Emeritus at the London School of Economics, where he founded the Center of Economic Performance and became its director. He's now the director of the Center's program on well-being. He was among the small group of economists who started to work on happiness when this theme was not yet very popular, and he studied the non-income variables that determined happiness, including mental health. Now Richard, those who know him, he has numerous scholarly scientific papers that have been published in our discipline's best journal. And he has in particular made important contributions to the analysis of European unemployment. So in his former academic life, there was a large period when he studied European unemployment, in particular in the 1980s when European unemployment was extremely high. And he has advised several British governments and several British parties, important parties in economic policy questions. His work on mental health resulted in improvements in the access to psychological therapies in the United Kingdom. Since 2000, he is a member of the House of Lords, and he has been a keen advocate of making subjective well-being of the people the central, or one of the central objectives of the government. In 2012, he co-edited with Jeffrey Sachs and John Halliwell the World Happiness Report. His influential book, Happiness, Lessons for a New Science, was published in 2005 and has sold over 150,000 copies in 20 languages. I think we are all eager to hear more about what makes people happy or unhappy. Ladies and gentlemen, here is Richard Layard.
Well, it's lovely to be here. The last time I was in Zurich, was for a meeting with the Dalai Lama, which some of you were at, where I took the opportunity of announcing that we were launching a movement called Action for Happiness. This happened the following year. And the first thing we had to do was to interview a director to run this movement. And one of the candidates had gone into the World Wide Web to see if there was any other organization that had the word happiness in its title. Interesting question. And this was the answer that came back on his computer screen. Your search for happiness has produced no results. Well, what I want to persuade you of is that we can do better than that. So thank you very much, Ernst, for asking me to come. It's also extremely nice to be here in Zurich because this has been the leading European Center for the Study of Happiness, first under Bruno Frey and then under Ernst. And as I'm sure you all know, Ernst has taken the subject to a new dimension through his work in the laboratory and the combination of brain science with laboratory investigations is really pushing the whole subject a lot further, but I'm not going to go into that. I'll talk about things that I understand. I always thought, actually, from when I was an undergraduate, that the best society was the one in which people were as happy as possible, and in particular, where there were as few people who were miserable as possible. And I think that should be the fundamental aim of our society in the 21st century. Of course, it's not a new idea. It goes back to the 18th century. The 18th century Enlightenment, which I think in a way it was the greatest idea of the 18th century Enlightenment. It very much influenced the development of early economics, but it was quite difficult to apply because there wasn't enough information about what makes people happy. And what has been happening in the 21st century is that because of the development of the new science of happiness, people are at last taking seriously this extraordinarily humane idea that we should judge our actions by their impact on the happiness of others. And this has now gone from a cultural and academic movement into politics, as you know. The heroes of this movement, actually, are the OECD, somewhat surprisingly, who started in 2004 raising the question, is GDP enough as a measure of progress? And they've had a series of conferences, 4 now, which have led to a European Union program called Beyond GDP. Then the UN has got interested, as Ernst was saying. They had a big conference on happiness for which we produced the World Happiness Report. But the most interesting thing recently is that Mrs. Merkel has got interested. Now she is going to be the president of the G7 next year, and she has decided that she wants well-being to be one of, or even the main theme of her presidency. And that is why a group of us who produced a report on well-being and policy 2 weeks ago, we decided to launch it in Berlin, and we launched it actually in the German Chancellery. I'd like to tell you a little bit about this. Let me see if I can operate this. Right. You can't see the picture, but anyway, here's the report. This is a report by quite an interesting collection. Gus O'Donnell was the top Treasury official in Britain, and then the top civil servant, and the top advisor to the Prime Minister. And for 10 years, he's been a secret agent of well-being. So we have now in Britain, in every department, a well-being division. And we were the first country that started making official statistical measurement of well-being. But now, actually, through the OECD initiative, all but 3 OECD member countries are making official collections of data on the well-being of the population. But what's also interesting here is that we wanted to go take this through further than just measurement. I mean, what's the point of measuring well-being unless you're going to do something about it? So we try to take this through from measurement to what do we know about the causes and what do we know about the policy implications. So in a sense, this talk is made easy for me by the fact that I was a member of this group, and I'm going to tell you the main themes that we address in this report. So first, why does happiness matter? Deep philosophical question. Then, can we measure it? Then, what causes it? Then, briefly, what effects does it have? And then, the policy implications for all the main parties in society. Now, why does happiness matter? This is a question, of course, going back to the ancients. And I will put it like this, which is a version of the way that Aristotle put it. You can say that there are many goods. Wealth is a good, health is a good, freedom is a good, and happiness is a good. But if you can then ask, well, why are these goods good? What makes these goods good? And, well, why does wealth good? Because people feel better if they have some money. Why is health good? Because people feel terrible if they're sick, and so on. But when you get to happiness, you ask the question, why does it matter how people feel? Does it matter if they feel good or bad? Why does it matter? You can't give any answer. It is so much more central to our thinking about what is important, ultimately than anything else, that it becomes apparent that the other things are deriving their goodness from the fact that they contribute to happiness, which is the ultimate good. I think this is, to me, a persuasive argument why we should think of it not just as a goal, as Ernst said, but as the goal for a society. That the society should be happy, but in particular, there should be an absence of misery. Well, then we have the question, can we measure it? The typical way we measure it is by asking people questions like, overall, how happy are you these days on the scale of 0 to 10? And of course, the question immediately arises, do the answers that people give mean anything, or are they just using their own private language which conveys no information? It does convey information, and here are 4 powerful reasons for taking seriously what people say about how they feel. First, if I'm the person being investigated and the researcher asks me how happy I am and then asks Ernst how happy he thinks I am, that's one set of reports by Ernst, either by the friend and another by the subject, highly correlated. So that we couldn't actually have much human society unless we knew something about what was going on inside each other. So that's a reason for taking seriously what people say. Next, that we can find good correlations between what people say and things which you would think would be likely to have genuine effects on how happy somebody was. Third, what people say is quite a good predictor of many things that they do, like whether they will leave their spouse, whether they will leave their job, and even whether they will die. So again, information content must be there. But the thing which got me into this subject, and this is a true statement, I would not have come into this subject had I not learned that scientists have discovered areas of the brain where the electrical activity is highly correlated with what people say about how they feel. And nobody can dispute the objectivity of the electrical measurements in the brain, and therefore I maintain nobody can dispute that there is an objective content in what people say about how they feel. So we're going to use what people say from now on as the measure of happiness. So, next question, how are we doing for happiness? How's the world doing? And the answer is that in many countries, happiness has not risen despite massive economic growth. And I'll just give you the figures for 3 countries. The US has got the longest time series back to 1950. These lines correspond to identical questions having been asked. So you can see there were 3 sets of surveys, none of which show an increase in happiness in the USA since 1950. Here is West Germany, where there are the 2 surveys, Eurobarometer and the Socio-Economic Panel. Again, neither of them showing an increase in happiness. But most interesting is China, where, of course, the most rapid economic growth ever recorded in human history has occurred. So these are 6 different surveys which certainly do not suggest any rise in happiness since 1990. They suggest a fall followed perhaps by a recovery, but they certainly don't suggest any rise at a time of massive economic growth, but of course also massive social dislocation. Now, this whole subject developed out of these findings, especially the ones for the USA, which were already apparent by the 1970s, that America was not getting happier in spite of miraculous growth at that time. The person who pointed this out is somebody called Richard Easterlin, University of Southern California. And what he pointed to was a remarkable paradox, which I'm sure will have struck all of you, which is that surely people want to become rich, and there must be some reason why they want to become rich. And the answer is that in any one country, at any one time, richer people are on average happier than poorer people. This is one of the best established findings in the subject, and indeed the slope of happiness against income is very similar in nearly every country. So how could you reconcile that with the fact that as people, as a group, become richer, they do not as a group become happier, they don't travel up that line. And of course, the most obvious explanation is that they're comparing themselves with each other, and therefore it's impossible for a society to become richer relative to itself, and therefore the society as a whole doesn't become happier. Another explanation, much preferred by psychologists, but I think somewhat disproved by economists, is that people are adapting to their income and they're getting used to it. I think that's probably another factor, but I think that the comparisons with other people are probably the most important factor. So this is the so-called Easterlin paradox, and as I say, the reconciliation between these 2 apparently contradictory facts would seem to be based mainly on relative income, but partly on adaptation. But I don't think we should think absolute income is unimportant. I think it's a perfectly reasonable thing for us to want to become richer as a society. I think we will. It's part of human creativity to become richer. But I think what I'm going to be trying to persuade you of as we go along and we see what really matters to people is that the jacking up of the rate of long-term economic growth doesn't make sense as a central objective for a government. Simply, it's just not so important as many other things that we're about to come to. Now, that's just an illustration of the relative point. you see the point that's being made there? Okay. So let's come on to the causes. Now, of course, if you want to understand the importance of social institutions, you have to compare countries or societies. Whereas if you want to look at the importance of individual factors, you can do that within one society. So I just want to give you first a picture of the situation across countries. Which is there. So you see what that is showing is something quite interesting. This is on the horizontal axis, income, and on the vertical axis, happiness. And these are the rich countries up at the top right-hand corner. And you can see that there is one broad fact now that the poorer countries are, as a group, less happy than the richer countries. But you'll also see that amongst the richer countries, there's no real correlation between income and happiness, whereas there is amongst the poorer countries. And what I want to stress to you also is that much of the variation there, which appears to be a variation with income, is in fact variation due to other causes which are associated with income. So, in this wonderful poll, the so-called Gallup World Poll, they ask them questions about if something bad happened, do you have someone to fall back on who will help you? Do you feel free to make the choices that you'd like to in life? Is your society corrupt? You can see that these factors are, in terms of their explanatory power, to explain the variation across countries, as powerful as the GDP itself. So the GDP has its role. I don't want to say it has no role at all. It has a role, particularly when you're near the subsistence level. But I'm wanting to stress that there are other social factors and even more other personal factors which are more important answers to my original question of what makes us happy. So let me now go on to the personal factors. Right. Now, we tried to summarize the evidence in the World Happiness Report that Ernst mentioned. That's the original one, the 2012 one. And I want to point out to those of you who are academics here how very unsatisfactory the state of our subject is, for one simple reason, that when people write about the causes of happiness, they write about one cause at a time. And you can never compare the strength of the different effects if that's the way knowledge is generated, because there's never a really common metric that enables you to compare the strength of the effects. And this is one reason why we're having difficulty in getting, say, finance ministries to take this seriously, because what they want, they're trying to divide up their money between health and education and social care and law and order and so on. What they want is a common metric that tells them simultaneously how important each of these different channels is in affecting the well-being of the population. So this is my passion at the moment, to try and get for policymakers a good set of measures that are reasonably authoritative, that come out of a whole range of different surveys, hopefully showing the same results, about the relative importance of different factors as they affect happiness. So we've made a start on this. And what you have to do, of course, is to look at the way in which well-being is determined over a person's lifetime, how it evolves. So this is just a very first shot using the so-called British cohort study, which is a study of all the children born in 1 month in 1970. So we're starting with looking at their situation in adulthood. We're measuring how satisfied they are with their life, and then we're trying to explain it by these different factors. So first comes income and education. Then we're moving on towards things which are more to do with their their relationships, if you like, whether they're employed, whether they're in the criminal class, whether they are living with someone they love. And then we're moving on to their internal state, their physical health and their mental health. Of course, there's an obvious problem in trying to use mental health to explain life satisfaction, because it looks a bit as if some of the questions are the same. So to get over that question, this mental health that I put there is measured 8 years earlier. So it's trying to measure their underlying situation in a way which is discrete from their circumstances and their current set of relationships. And what you can see is these are, again, our partial correlation coefficients that show the comparative explanatory power of these different factors. You can see that mental health is the absolutely biggest one. And that all these relationship variables add up to a lot more than income in explaining the variation of life satisfaction in the population. And in fact, what is very striking, if you take the income number, and this is completely consistent with all the other surveys, and you say, what proportion of the variance of life satisfaction in the population is explained by the variance of income? It is, guess what? Well, if you're very clever, you can see that there's a number here less than 0.1. So the result has got to be less than 0.01, which is 1% of the variance. So income is explaining a very, very small part of the variation of happiness and misery in our populations. And this is true actually in every country. Even in the poorest countries, less than 2% is explained by income. There are just so many personal factors that are affecting the variation of happiness. And I would say that physical and mental health are extraordinarily important in that regard. Now, that's just one survey of the British population, but I thought you would be interested to see some others, namely the German socio-economic panel, the Australian panel, and there's also a separate British panel survey. And I've arranged this slightly differently because I think it's a slightly provocative way of doing it. You can say, well, we know what life satisfaction people have. Why don't we just cut the group into two, people in the bottom 10% and people in the top 90%, and call the people in the bottom 10% miserable, and then let's say what are the causes of misery, just for a change. It's rather striking, isn't it, you see, particularly when you get the results here. Oops. Right, so these are three surveys, as I say. And again, you'll see that mental illness or mental health in an earlier period is much the most powerful predictor. And the next is physical health, and the next is poverty and unemployment. So I think, we can make a rather strong statement that mental health and physical health are more important determinants. They explain more of the misery in our society than poverty. This is dynamite. You have to be very careful not to get lynched when you say these things. But I think that this is telling us that, contrary to what economists always said, that the way to deal with misery is to redistribute income, this is saying no. The way to deal with misery is to enable people to regain control of their lives by the services that you give them rather than by the money that you give them. That's the conclusion I'm going to be coming to in a moment. I should say, incidentally, to academics present here, that this is the pooled data. This is essentially the result of a cross-sectional analysis, but you can also do it with a fixed effect. So you're looking at the effect of changes of each of these determinants of misery on the change of whether you're miserable or not. And you can get the same ranking as I've shown you there. So it's a powerful story. Now, these are the results of looking at adults in terms of what their relatively immediate causes of their happiness and misery are. But of course, you would then want to know, well, how did these people get into the situations that they're in? How did they get to be unemployed, poor, physically ill, etc.? By going further back in their lives. So the last slide I'm going to show you of this type says, let's go back into childhood and let's look at the different aspects of the development of our children. I mean, as parents, what are we sort of noting about our children? We're certainly interested in how they're doing academically. We're probably interested in how they're behaving. And I think as parents, we are mostly interested in how happy they are. Are they depressed? Are they anxious? These are three quite different dimensions. And they're none of them terribly strongly correlated with each other. So you know which way I'm arguing, but I'll ask you just to guess in your own mind the ordering between, this is which of these three, academic, behavioral, or emotional development, which of these three is the best predictor of whether the resulting adult will be satisfied with their life? And we just remember how we're telling them, you know, if you don't do your homework, you won't be satisfied with how your life goes and so on. But what about the other thing? Anyway, here's the result. Okay, so the emotional health is much the most powerful predictor. And the academic development is the least powerful predictor. And this is obviously saying important things about what should be at least paid more attention to in our school system than just, I don't think Switzerland is as bad as Britain, but we are turning our schools into simple exam factories where you don't even learn anything in order to, know it, but in order to pass the exam. But this is something that absolutely has to be reversed. Well, I have the feeling that everybody here thinks that happiness is an end in itself. But just to carry the argument forward a bit with people who don't, let me also point out that happiness is a very important instrument for achieving other things if you don't think that the happiness matters in itself. So happiness is in fact quite a good determinant of many other things that we think matter, like longevity, like educational achievement, like whether you are in work, and like indeed, and I'll give you more evidence on this, how productive you are at work. So that's a bit of an aside before we come to policy implications, because even if you didn't think happiness was an end in itself, you would, I hope, think that it should be promoted as an instrument. So let's go on to policy implications. Now, you can imagine I'm going to start with health and mental health promotion as well as health. Then I'm going to go on to policy implications for employers and workplaces. And then I'm going to go on to government, and then I'm going to end with individuals. Okay, so this is my current course. We have good surveys, household surveys in the population, which enable us to know how many people would be diagnosed as mentally ill, in particular how many would be diagnosed with either depression or an anxiety disorder like obsessive-compulsive, PTSD, etc., panic attacks. And the answer is something like 1 in 6. It varies a bit between countries, but 1 in 6 would be a goodish number. So this is a very big problem. And actually, you will discover this at dinner parties. if any of you were to say, somebody said, what are you working on? And you said mental health, you'd be amazed what they say next. I mean, they always say, oh, my daughter, or my mother-in-law, or it's never very far away, the person that they start discussing with you. It is just a very, very big problem that is not talked about properly in the policy arenas relative to the size of the problem. So the good feature of the situation is that we have good treatments for this condition. We have antidepressants which have goodish short-term effects and can have reasonable long-term effects if you keep taking them, but you have to be careful with that. But more important, we have what people mainly want, which is psychological therapies. So we have now evidence-based psychological therapies, like cognitive behavioral therapy, where you don't have to go on forever, and you don't go on talking about how awful your parents were all the time. You talk about how to get control over your emotional life, and you're given tools which enable you to do that. And these have, within 10 sessions, an average recovery rate of 50%, and a much reduced rate of relapse in the case of depression. For anxiety disorders, if you cure them, they're more or less cured for life in most cases. But for depression, of course, it has a tendency to recur, but much reduced if you have been relieved of one episode through evidence-based psychological therapy. In Britain, we have a wonderful organization called NICE, which recommends what kind of treatments there should be for all physical and mental health conditions. So it's recommended. But the extraordinary situation was that it wasn't being provided. It's just disregard. They just disregard the recommendations of the experts when it comes to the commissioning of mental health. So this is where it's an advantage to be an economist, because you can do a few simple cost calculations, and you can see that because mental health is the biggest illness of working age. In fact, it accounts for nearly half of all illness up to the age of 50. So you can see the economic cost of it is enormous, and the cost to the exchequer is enormous in terms of disability benefits. Also, we now know that mental illness makes people go to the doctor a lot more with physical illnesses. And therefore, if we can cure the mental illness, we can save an awful lot on disability benefits and on physical health care, enough to completely pay for the original cost of the therapy. But the shocking thing is that in every country, only about 1/4 of the people who would benefit from treatment are getting any treatment, and that is mostly the antidepressants. I'm not against antidepressants. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. This is a particularly tragic case where it didn't even work on the rat. But the main thing is to get psychological therapy provided. Ernst referred to the fact that we have launched what is, I think, a really path-breaking program of providing evidence-based psychological therapy to people who need it in Britain. Since 2008, we've trained 6,000 therapists, and we're now treating 500,000 people a year within our National Health Service. And a lot of countries, I don't think this is one of them, but a lot of countries are beginning to think about copying this initiative. Let me go on to prevention. Obviously, it's much better to prevent mental illness than to have to cure it. So there are things we could do to help parents be better parents. Parenting classes with proper attention to the emotional side of child rearing, and indeed to the impact of children on the relationship between the parents, have been shown to have good results. Parent training for parents whose children behave badly has been shown to have lasting results over a 10-year follow-up on the children. Couples therapy for parents in conflict has been shown to improve their mental health and relationships. These are things, I think, that if we're thinking about what is the role of the state, I think we've got to get to grips with this. That if we think that happiness is why we have a state, to try and make us more happy than we would be in the absence of government, these are areas where the state can make a real difference. And these may be more important ways of using money than simple cash redistribution without helping people to get control over their lives. So parents and children is one area. The next area would be schools. As I say, we don't want them to be exam factories. We need a school ethos based on concern for, well, the well-being of everybody, including the teachers and parents. But we also need a curriculum which involves the teaching of life skills. There are a large number of evidence-based programs now which have been shown to have smallish effects. And I've given you some numbers there. These are short-run effects. And we did one trial, which one of you was mentioning earlier, to me, of the PEN Resilience program designed by Martin Seligman and his colleagues, which has good short-run effects, but we followed them up for quite a while, and they do fade. And I think it's unreasonable. And in a way, it shows the sort of poverty of the situation we're in, that we think that we're doing well if we're getting a 20-hour program to deal with something which is fundamental to somebody's life. I mean, this should be built right into the curriculum year after year, and that's what we are now trialing, an evidence-based life skills curriculum going on right through the secondary curriculum. And then I always like to mention school discipline. You're not meant to mention it. Children, actually, it's a very good predictor of children's happiness. They don't like being in undisciplined schools. Not only they don't learn, but they feel wretched and ill at ease. And yet we have actually good programs which are not that different from these psychological therapies for teaching teachers to produce calm in the classroom. Let me just go on. Ernst, how much? I should stop in about 5 minutes, shouldn't I? 5 to 10 minutes, okay. Well, at work, I think some of you are employers here. The first point to make is the one I made before, that a happy workforce, there's some evidence. I wouldn't say it's overwhelming. And of course, it has to be done in the right way. It's not any old happiness that will raise productivity, but workplaces that try to make the morale of the workers better experience increased productivity. This is a whole finding from that industry. But the thing which most impressed me is that the 100 best places to work had a share price increase over 25 years that was 50% higher. Not the increase, a share price that rose 50% relative to the rest of the stock market. So that I think is an important finding. I was involved with the World Economic Forum, and we produced a report on this. And we thought that how can we get companies to take the worker well-being seriously? Well, let them do a survey and publish the results on the front page of the annual report. This, incidentally, might also help in schools, to get schools to take it seriously. Measurement, in an age of measurement, you better measure it if you treasure it. But then how, if you wanted to improve worker well-being, how would you do it? Here's the most depressing finding of all well-being research. some of well-being research is done by asking people sort of hour by hour how happy they are. And the time of day in which workers are least happy, or people are least happy, is when they are in the same room as their boss. This is it's quite a reflection on the quality of leadership, isn't it? The leaders, apparently, they try to they lead through fear rather than through inspiration and uplift. Better job design, I think I won't spend a lot of time on that. You know the basic principles. People need to know what they're meant to do, but be given some autonomy in doing it. They need to have support and appreciation for what they do. But I think it's worth mentioning this question of absence. If a person has got a mental health problem, they're very likely to go off sick. And it is strongly in the interest of a firm, obviously, to handle this problem in a way which enables the person to recover and get back into productive work. This means that the person who has to handle it should be the line manager and not the human relations department. And there should be an ease of asking, what's the problem? Because there is a sufficiently good relationship between the line manager and the worker in question. And then, of course, there should be a willingness to plan the return to work in a way which is feasible, and, of course, to get the person some treatment. I'll just put up this very controversial slide. There's not time to do justice to this subject. But I think that the general tenor of findings from well-being research makes one want to question the principal-agent model and the way in which it's applied in deriving payment systems. The notion that the most important payoff for a worker is financial rather than appreciation is not obvious, particularly when the issue is how to arrange at the financial payment, where people are involved in teamwork, how you can create invidious situations by saying that somebody's done better than somebody else, and so on top of which there are these extraordinary results. I think Dan Ariely gave a talk here once. I mean, he has got these extraordinary findings that when you pay people for performing in tests, and you pay them according to how many answers they get right, they get fewer answers right than if you don't pay them. Because people get so flustered and so bothered about this payment and how the bonus is going to go, they just can't concentrate calmly on the matter in hand. I think these are very interesting findings. And of course they relate to this point that there is an intrinsic motivation that people have to do things well. And you have to be very careful not to displace that by trying to introduce other motives which you think amplify it, but they can in fact destroy it. Government, I think I've probably said enough about. We want governments to look at what really matters to people. We want a new form of cost-benefit analysis where well-being is the unit in which benefits are measured. And of course, we want everybody, always, who does any survey of anything, to include well-being. But I just want to come back now to the individual. Obviously, in the end, what governments do, and even what our employers do, is less important for our happiness than what we ourselves do. And there are secrets of a happy life, which we have learned, many of us in many different sources. But I just put up two of them there. I think positive thinking, what you might call mindfulness, enjoying what you've got, rather than all the time trying to get what you think you need and don't have. These are incredibly important things to learn, and they can be learned in some sort of a systematic way, be it in church or in a mindfulness-based stress reduction course or in a Buddhist temple or somewhere. But equally, not just pursuing your own happiness, but pursuing the happiness of others. Obviously, if we're concerned with, are we going to have a happier society? I mean, will the result be a good distribution of happiness? It's not going to be a very good distribution of happiness if each person is only pursuing their own happiness. So we really want people to be pursuing the happiness of others as one of their major objectives in life. Is that a realistic thing to be trying to bring about? I am in a pulpit here, aren't I? So I can say this. I think it is realistic in the sense that there are two sides to our nature. There is certainly a very selfish side to our nature, but there is also a cooperative side to our nature. And I do believe that if we develop the cooperative side of our nature, that is then a payoff to ourselves. And Ernst has done interesting work on this and others in behavioral economics and neuroscience, which show that when you do the right thing to other people, you do get a payoff. And it's a payoff not unlike the sense of reward you get from doing other things that are satisfying. So how are we to get this cultural change? I think we really need a cultural change. This action for happiness that I mentioned at the beginning, this is just one of many efforts which are going on at the moment to try and promote what we do need, which is a cultural change in the direction of more positive thinking and more altruistic living. In this action for happiness, we do ask people to pledge to try to create more happiness in the world and less misery. I hope that some of you might feel inclined to go and look at our website and remember the tragic result that I mentioned to you on the computer screen, but change it, because I do think that our search for happiness can produce results. Thank you very much.